The silent storm. Kira Valdez walked through the glass doors of Westfield Regional High School with the same careful steps she'd taken every morning for the past 3 months. Her worn sneakers made no sound against the polished linoleum as she navigated through clusters of students toward her locker. At barely 5 feet tall, with a slight frame hidden beneath oversized sweaters, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible. The morning routine never varied. Arrive early, retrieve books quickly, and slip into first period before the hallways filled with the thunderous energy of students who belonged here. Students who didn't spend their lunch periods hiding in the far corner of the library or eating alone in empty classrooms. Westfield Regional sprawled across 40 acres in suburban Colorado, its red brick buildings and manicured lawns suggesting prosperity and tradition. The school housed nearly 3,000 students across 2 massive main buildings connected by covered walkways, with additional structures for athletics, performing arts, and technical programs. Most families had lived in the district for generations, their children flowing seamlessly into social hierarchies established long before Kira's family had moved here from New Mexico. Her father, a soft-spoken mechanic who'd taken a job at the local auto plant, had promised this move would give them a fresh start. Her mother, who cleaned offices downtown in the early morning hours, had smiled hopefully when they'd driven past the school's impressive facade that first day. Neither understood that starting over at 17 meant entering a world where every social position had been claimed years earlier. Kira's locker sat in the least desirable section of Building A, near the maintenance closets where the fluorescent lights flickered, and the air held a faint chemical smell. She spun the combination with practiced efficiency, grabbing her physics textbook and notebook before someone could notice her standing there. The morning bell would ring in 12 minutes, giving her enough time to claim a back corner seat in Mr. Peterson's classroom. She'd almost made it when they appeared. "Well, well, look who's scurrying around again." Blake Morrison's voice carried the confident drawl of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders of a varsity linebacker and sandy hair that never seemed out of place, he moved through the school like he owned it. In many ways, he did. His father sat on the school board, his mother ran the booster club, and his older brother had graduated 3 years earlier as student body president and homecoming king. Blake's inner circle materialized around him with the coordinated precision of a wolf pack. Trevor Hutchins stood to his right, nearly as tall but leaner, with sharp features and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog weaknesses in everyone he encountered. He served as Blake's strategist, the one who identified targets and planned campaigns of humiliation with mathematical precision. On Blake's left lurked Mason Torres, shorter but stockier, with thick arms that strained against his Letterman jacket. Mason specialized in the physical aspects of their harassment, using his wrestling background to execute accidental shoves and trips with plausible deniability. His laugh, deep and mocking, had become soundtrack to Kira's worst moments at school. The fourth member of their group, Ashley Brennan, possessed a different kind of cruelty. Tall and blonde with the kind of perfectly curated appearance that graced social media feeds, she wielded words like surgical instruments, finding precisely the right comment to destroy someone's confidence. Her presence legitimized their behavior in the eyes of other students who might otherwise intervene. Behind them trailed Derek Walsh, a nervous sophomore who'd attached himself to the group seeking protection through association. He rarely initiated anything, but always laughed loudest at their jokes, desperate to maintain his tenuous position in their social orbit. "I heard she talks to herself in Spanish," Ashley said, examining her manicured nails with theatrical boredom. "My dad says people like that should learn English if they want to live here." Kira's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She'd learned that responding only encouraged them, feeding their appetite for confrontation. Her parents had raised her to be proud of her heritage, speaking Spanish at home and maintaining connections to family in Albuquerque. But here, her accent marked her as different, her appearance suggesting she didn't belong among the predominantly white student body. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Blake stepped sideways, blocking her path. Students continued flowing around them, avoiding eye contact with the practiced skill of those who'd learned not to see things that might require action. Kira stopped, clutching her textbook against her chest like armor. She raised her eyes just enough to meet Blake's stare, a mistake that registered immediately in the predatory smile spreading across his face. "That's better. See, she does understand English." He turned to his friends with exaggerated relief. "For a minute there, I thought we might need to call immigration services." Trevor chuckled, a sound like ice cracking. "Maybe we should check if she has her papers." The comment hit its target with surgical precision. Kira's family had immigrated legally when she was 8, but the suggestion carried implications that made her stomach clench. She'd grown up hearing stories from relatives about encounters with authorities, the constant fear that came with being visible in the wrong way at the wrong time. "Leave me alone," she said quietly, her slight accent more pronounced when she was nervous. "Oh, she speaks." Mason clapped slowly, the sound echoing off the lockers. "But I think she meant, 'Please leave me alone, sir.' Right? Isn't that how your people are supposed to talk to your betters?" Heat flooded Kira's cheeks, but she forced herself to remain still. Behind her carefully neutral expression, a different part of her mind catalogued details with clinical precision. Blake favored his right side, probably from an old football injury that still affected his stance. Trevor's shoulders rolled forward slightly, suggesting weak core muscles beneath his height advantage. Mason's balance shifted to his back foot when he talked, a defensive habit that would make him vulnerable to certain techniques. These observations came automatically, the product of 8 years spent in her Uncle Miguel's garage-turned-dojo in Albuquerque. Miguel had been a Marines veteran who'd learned Krav Maga and mixed martial arts during his deployments, bringing those skills home to teach neighborhood kids self-defense. He'd started training Kira when she was 9, after she'd come home crying about playground bullies. "Violence is always the last option, mija," he'd told her repeatedly. "But when someone threatens your safety or your family, you respond with everything you have. You end it completely, so they never think about trying again." For 8 years, she'd trained 4 days a week, learning to use her small size and quick reflexes as advantages rather than limitations. Miguel had emphasized practical techniques over flashy moves, teaching her to target vital points and use leverage to overcome larger opponents. By the time her family moved to Colorado, she could handle herself against most of Miguel's adult students. But that knowledge remained locked away, hidden behind a wall of circumstances that made fighting back seem impossible. Her parents worked too hard to risk their jobs over school politics. Her father's position at the plant was still probationary. Her mother's cleaning contracts could be cancelled without cause. Drawing attention through violence, even in self-defense, could destroy everything they'd worked to build. So she stood frozen while Blake leaned closer, his breath carrying the mint of expensive gum and underlying arrogance. "You know what I think? I think you need to learn some respect. Maybe we should teach you how things work around here." The first period bell cut through the tension like a blade. Students began moving with more purpose toward classrooms, and Blake stepped back with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over," he said, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Next time you should remember your manners." They walked away laughing, their voices carrying down the hallway as Kira finally allowed herself to breathe. She hurried toward physics class, sliding into her usual back corner seat just as Mr. Peterson began taking attendance. Her hands shook slightly as she opened her notebook, the aftermath of adrenaline and suppressed anger. "Miss Valdez?" Mr. Peterson's voice drew her back to the present. "Here," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes where she spoke only when directly questioned and ate lunch alone in the library's reference section. She'd discovered that Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, rarely bothered students who appeared to be studying, allowing Kira to spend the period hidden among the academic journals and outdated encyclopedias. But they found her again during the afternoon break between classes. This time the confrontation occurred near the gymnasium, in a corridor that connected the main building to the athletic facilities. Fewer students used this route, giving Blake's group more freedom to operate without witnesses. "Look who's trying to sneak around again," Trevor called out, as Kira attempted to take an alternate route to her next class. "I don't think we finished our conversation this morning." Ashley fell into step beside her, uncomfortably close. "I've been thinking about what we discussed, about respect and knowing your place. I don't think you really understood the lesson." Kira quickened her pace, but Mason moved ahead to block the hallway. His thick arms crossed over his chest as he planted himself like an immovable obstacle. "Where are you going so fast?" he asked with false concern. "We're just trying to be friendly, help you understand how things work at Westfield." "Yeah," Derek added from behind them, his voice cracking slightly. "We're like a welcoming committee." Blake approached from her left side, forcing her to turn toward the wall of lockers. "The thing is, respect goes both ways. You show us proper respect, and we'll make sure other people treat you right. But if you keep acting like you're too good to talk to us..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken, but perfectly clear. Kira's eyes darted toward the main hallway, but Trevor had positioned himself to cut off that escape route. The corridor felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as her heart rate accelerated. "I just want to go to class," she said, proud that her voice didn't betray the fear building in her chest. "Class can wait," Ashley replied smoothly. "This is more important. Character building, you could say. See, the problem is that you think you can just ignore us. Walk around like we don't exist. That's not how it works here." Mason stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. "My family's been in this town for 4 generations. Blake's grandfather helped build this school. Trevor's dad owns 3 businesses downtown. And you," he paused for effect, "you're nobody. Your family's nobody. So when we try to include you in conversation, you should be grateful." The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. Her family did live in the apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Her parents did work jobs that made them invisible to the community's power structure. But Uncle Miguel's voice echoed in her memory. "They can make you feel small if you let them, Mija, but remember what you're capable of. Remember what you've earned through blood and sweat." Kira straightened slightly, meeting Mason's stare directly. "I need to get to class." The simple statement hung between them like a challenge. Blake's eyebrows rose in surprise at her directness, while Trevor's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Did she just..." Ashley's voice trailed off in theatrical disbelief. "Did she just dismiss us?" The 5-minute passing period was nearly over, and a few students hurried past them toward the gymnasium entrance. None looked in their direction, maintaining the willful blindness that kept them safe from similar treatment. Blake leaned against the lockers, blocking her path more completely. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You seem to think you have choices here, that you can just walk away when we're talking to you." His voice carried the casual confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything he wanted. "But that's not how this works. See, people like you need people like us, for protection, for acceptance. Without that, school becomes a very lonely place." "Exactly," Trevor added, his tone academically detached. "It's basic social dynamics. Hierarchy exists for a reason. Everyone has their place, their role to play. Fighting that natural order only makes things harder for everyone." Kira felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being cornered, but something else stirred beneath the anxiety. 8 years of training had conditioned her to assess threats and calculate responses, Blake's positioning left his center line exposed. Trevor's height made him top-heavy and vulnerable to leg sweeps. Mason's crossed arms limited his reaction time, but she pushed those thoughts away, forcing herself to remember the larger picture. Her parents' sacrifices, the fresh start they'd worked so hard to build, the consequences that would follow any violent confrontation. "I understand," she said quietly, hating the words even as they left her mouth. Blake's smile widened with satisfaction. "Good. I knew you were smarter than you looked, so from now on, when we want to talk, you listen. When we ask questions, you answer. And maybe, if you're really good at following directions, we'll make sure other people leave you alone too." The late bell rang, signaling that students should be in their classrooms. Kira seized the moment to slip past Mason, walking quickly toward her next class without looking back. Behind her, she heard Ashley's laugh and Blake's voice saying something about training that she chose not to process. Chemistry class passed in a haze of molecular diagrams and periodic tables that she couldn't concentrate on. Her mind kept replaying the confrontation, analyzing what she should have said or done differently. Mrs. Rodriguez called on her twice, receiving mumbled responses that earned concerned looks but no follow-up questions. After school, Kira walked the 2 miles home to Riverside Gardens, the apartment complex where her family rented a small 2-bedroom unit. The building showed its age in peeling paint and cracked sidewalks, but her mother had made their space warm with colorful curtains and the smell of homemade cooking. "¿Cómo estuvo la escuela?" her mother asked as Kira entered the kitchen where dinner preparations were already underway. "Fine," Kira replied in English, not trusting herself to maintain composure in Spanish. Her mother's intuitive understanding of emotional nuances seemed stronger in their native language. Elena Valdez studied her daughter's face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent years reading between lines. She'd cleaned enough office buildings to recognize the signs of people under stress, and something in Kira's posture triggered maternal alarms. "Are you making friends?" she asked carefully, switching to English to match her daughter's preference. "Some," Kira lied, opening her textbook at the kitchen table. "I have homework." Her father arrived an hour later, his work clothes stained with automotive fluids and his face tired from a 10-hour shift. Carlos Valdez had thick hands and gentle eyes, the kind of man who fixed things quietly and never complained about the cost of providing for his family. Over dinner, they talked about safe topics, his work at the plant, her mother's new cleaning contract at the medical building, Kira's grades, which remained consistently high despite her social struggles. Nobody mentioned the careful way she held herself or the fact that she never talked about classmates anymore. That night, alone in her room, Kira allowed herself to remember Uncle Miguel's garage and the confidence she'd felt there. She practiced forms in the small space between her bed and dresser, moving through combinations that had once felt as natural as breathing. The movements helped calm her mind, but they also reminded her of the growing distance between who she was and who she had to pretend to be. The next morning brought a repeat performance in the hallway outside her locker. Blake's group had apparently decided that daily check-ins were necessary to maintain their newly established dynamic. This time, Ashley took the lead, commenting loudly about Kira's clothes while the others laughed appreciatively. I guess if you can't afford anything better." Ashley's voice carried clearly down the hallway, designed to be overheard by passing students. "But there are places that donate clothes to people like that. My mom volunteers at one sometimes." The casual cruelty stung worse than direct insults. Ashley's comments positioned her as charitable and concerned, while simultaneously highlighting Kira's family's financial situation and her own powerlessness to respond. "Maybe we should start a collection," Trevor suggested with mock enthusiasm. "Get the whole school involved. I bet lots of people would want to help out." Derek giggled nervously. "We could call it Clothes for Charity Cases." Kira closed her locker with deliberate care, refusing to let them see how the words affected her. She'd worn the same jeans 3 times this week because her family could afford to do laundry only once weekly at the expensive machines in the complex's basement. Her sweater had a small hole near the hem that she'd carefully sewn shut, but Ashley's sharp eyes had probably noticed it anyway. "What do you think?" Blake asked, stepping closer. "Would you like us to organize something like that? Get the whole school involved in helping you out?" The threat was clear. Refuse their mockery, and they'd escalate to public humiliation involving the entire student body. Accept it and establish herself as someone who deserved their contempt. "No, thank you," she said quietly. "No, thank you, what?" Mason prompted. The pause stretched uncomfortably as Kira wrestled with her pride. Around them, students continued hurrying to first period, their averted eyes speaking volumes about the social dynamics at work. "No, thank you, Blake," she finally managed. "Better," he said with the satisfied tone of a trainer rewarding a performing animal. "See how easy it is when you remember your manners." The pattern continued throughout the week. Morning confrontations that established dominance, afternoon encounters that reinforced it, and constant low-level harassment that kept her on edge. They began timing their appearances to maximize disruption, showing up when she tried to eat lunch in empty classrooms or study in quiet corners of the library. The systematic nature of their campaign revealed Trevor's strategic mind at work. They never did anything dramatic enough to attract administrative attention, but maintained steady pressure designed to wear down her resistance. Comments about her appearance, her family's economic status, her accent, and her social isolation created a comprehensive assault on her self-worth. Friday brought escalation. Blake's group cornered her in the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors of Building B, a location they'd clearly scouted for its lack of foot traffic during the lunch period. This time, they weren't content with verbal harassment. "You know what I've been thinking?" Blake said as they formed their familiar circle around her. "I think you need to learn how to show proper respect when you see us, like really demonstrate that you understand where you stand." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "I've seen this in movies. When someone knows their place, they bow or curtsy, something to show they acknowledge their betters." Trevor's cold smile suggested this had been planned carefully. "It's really about respect, basic social courtesy. When you see us coming, you should stop what you're doing and show proper deference." Mason cracked his knuckles with deliberate intimidation. "My wrestling coach always says you've got to break people down before you can build them up. Maybe that's what you need, some breaking down." Derek shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tone, but unwilling to voice dissent. His position in the group was too precarious to risk defending someone else. Kira felt her breathing quicken as the walls seemed to close in around her. The stairwell amplified their voices, creating an echo chamber of hostility. Her training kicked in automatically, cataloging escape routes and potential weapons, but the rational part of her mind maintained control. "I have to get to class," she said, attempting to move toward the stairs. Blake blocked her path with casual authority. "Class can wait. This is more important. Character development, you could say. Now I want you to practice showing respect. Start with a bow." The command hung in the air like a physical presence. Around them, the stairwell remained empty, the lunch period providing perfect cover for whatever they had planned. Kira's hands clenched into fists at her sides, muscle memory from years of training threatening to override her carefully maintained control. "Bow," Ashley repeated, her voice sharp with authority, "like you're meeting royalty, because that's basically what we are here." "And say, 'I'm sorry for being disrespectful,'" Trevor added with clinical detachment. "Let's establish some proper protocols going forward." Mason stepped closer, using his bulk to create additional pressure. "Coach always says that respect has to be earned through action, so let's see some action." The moment stretched endlessly as competing impulses warred in Kira's mind. Uncle Miguel's voice urged her to fight, to end this humiliation before it could establish a precedent. But her parents' faces appeared in her memory, reminding her of everything they'd sacrificed for this fresh start. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered her head in a gesture that barely qualified as a bow. Blake's triumphant laugh echoed off the concrete walls. "There we go. See how easy it is when you remember your place, but I didn't hear an apology." "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "Sorry for what?" Ashley prompted with sweet viciousness. "For being disrespectful." "Perfect." Trevor clapped slowly, his approval carrying more menace than outright threats. "I think we're making real progress here. From now on, whenever you see us, I expect the same level of courtesy." "Understood?" Kira nodded without lifting her head, unwilling to let them see the tears of rage building in her eyes. The sound of their footsteps echoed as they climbed the stairs, leaving her alone in the stairwell with the taste of humiliation burning in her throat. That afternoon, she walked home through neighborhoods where houses grew larger and more expensive as the distance from school decreased. These streets belonged to families like Blake's, where children grew up expecting deference and receiving it. Her own neighborhood lay beyond the railway tracks that served as an unofficial boundary between the prosperous and the struggling. At home, her mother took one look at her face and began preparing café con leche without asking questions. The familiar ritual provided comfort, but couldn't wash away the memory of that stairwell or the knowledge that Monday would bring more of the same. "Mija," her mother said gently, settling at the kitchen table with her own cup. "You know you can talk to me about anything." Kira wanted to tell her everything, about Blake's group and their systematic campaign, about the humiliation and the constant fear, about the way she had to hide who she really was just to survive each day. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that their sacrifice to give her a better life had trapped her in a nightmare she couldn't escape? "School is just hard," she said finally. "Making friends is harder than I thought." Eleanor studied her daughter's face with maternal intuition that missed nothing. "Some people make themselves feel big by making others feel small. But remember what your Uncle Miguel always said. You are stronger than you know." The comment hit closer to home than her mother realized. Miguel's lessons had given her strength, but they'd also created an impossible contradiction. She possessed the skills to end her torment, but using them would destroy everything her family had worked to achieve. That weekend, she called Uncle Miguel from the privacy of her bedroom, using the phone card her parents bought monthly to maintain connections with family in New Mexico. "Mija," his voice carried warmth and genuine pleasure. "How is Colorado? Are you liking the new school?" For a moment, she almost told him everything. Miguel had always been her refuge, the one adult who understood her completely. But the distance between them felt insurmountable now, measured in more than miles. "It's different," she said carefully. "The people here are different." Something in her tone caught his attention. "Different how? Are people giving you trouble?" "Not trouble exactly, just adjustment problems." Miguel's silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had been lost. When he spoke again, his voice carried the gravity of someone who'd seen real conflict. "Kira, listen to me carefully. What I taught you wasn't just about fighting. It was about confidence, about knowing that you can handle whatever comes your way. Sometimes, just knowing you can defend yourself changes how you carry yourself, how you respond to threats." "But what if fighting makes things worse? What if there are consequences I can't control?" "There are always consequences, Mija. The question is whether you can live with the consequences of doing nothing. But remember, I never taught you to be a bully. I taught you to protect yourself and others who can't protect themselves. There's a difference." After the call ended, She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling and wrestling with impossible choices. Miguel was right about confidence changing how she carried herself, but he didn't understand the specific dynamics at Westfield. The social hierarchies here had deep roots, and challenging them required more than individual courage. Monday arrived with the inevitability of a natural disaster. Kira dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would attract minimal attention while preparing mentally for whatever Blake's group had planned. They'd established their dominance so completely that she found herself anticipating their demands, calculating how to minimize humiliation while avoiding escalation. The morning encounter occurred near the cafeteria entrance, where breakfast crowds provided an audience for their theater. Blake had positioned himself strategically, ensuring maximum visibility for whatever performance he'd planned. Well, look who learned her manners on Friday," he announced loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "I think we're making real progress with our little project." Ashley moved to block Kira's path, her perfectly styled appearance contrasting sharply with Kira's simple clothes and careful invisibility. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about respect and knowing your place. I think it's time for the next lesson." Trevor's calculating gaze swept the cafeteria crowd, measuring their attention and ensuring optimal positioning for maximum impact. Public courtesy is so important. It shows character, breeding, the kind of values that separate civilized people from others. Mason crossed his arms with familiar intimidation, his wrestling-trained bulk creating physical pressure even without direct contact. "My grandfather always said you can judge a person's character by how they treat their superiors. Shows discipline, proper upbringing." Derek hovered nervously at the edge of the group, his anxious energy suggesting he understood they were approaching dangerous territory but lacked the courage to voice concerns. "So here's what's going to happen," Blake continued with the casual authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "When you see us coming, you're going to stop whatever you're doing and show proper respect, like we practiced on Friday, but this time you're going to do it properly, in front of everyone." The cafeteria noise continued around them, but Kira could feel the attention of nearby students focusing on their confrontation. Some watched openly, hungry for drama that didn't directly threaten them. Others maintained elaborate pretenses of not noticing while straining to catch every word. "I think a curtsy would be appropriate," Ashley suggested with theatrical sweetness, "something that really demonstrates understanding of social hierarchies." "And an apology for past disrespect," Trevor added with clinical precision, "something clear and unambiguous that establishes proper protocols going forward." Kira felt the familiar tightness in her chest as the circle closed around her. But something else stirred beneath the anxiety. The systematic nature of their humiliation campaign had revealed their fundamental weakness. They needed an audience to validate their power. Without witnesses to their dominance, their authority became meaningless. "Come on," Blake said with growing impatience. "We don't have all day. Show everyone how a person in your position is supposed to behave around their betters." The command hung in the air as conversations at nearby tables gradually quieted. Students sensed developing drama and turned their attention toward the confrontation with the mixture of fascination and relief that came from watching someone else become the target. Kira looked around the circle of faces surrounding her, then at the growing audience of classmates who watched with careful detachment. The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. She could submit to this public humiliation and establish a precedent that would follow her for the rest of her time at Westfield, or she could make a choice that would change everything. "No," she said quietly. The simple word fell into the expectant silence, like a stone into still water. Blake's confident expression flickered with uncertainty as he processed what he'd heard. "Excuse me?" Ashley's voice rose with disbelief. "Did you just refuse a reasonable request?" "I said no." Kira's voice carried more strength this time, drawing surprised looks from students who'd grown accustomed to her careful invisibility. Trevor's calculating mind immediately recognized the shift in dynamics. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You seem to believe you have choices here, but that's not how this works." Mason stepped closer, using his size to create intimidation. "Maybe she didn't understand the question. Let me make it clearer. You're going to show respect, or we're going to teach you why that's important." The threat hung between them as surrounding conversations died completely. Students at nearby tables turned their full attention to the confrontation, sensing that something significant was developing. Kira felt 8 years of training stirring beneath her carefully maintained facade. Uncle Miguel's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, the only way to stop a bully is to show them that you're not afraid to fight back. But when you fight to end it completely." "No," she repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the cafeteria silence. Blake's face, flushed with anger and embarrassment, being defied publicly threatened the authority he'd worked years to establish, and his response would determine how other students viewed his power. "Fine," he said with dangerous calm. "I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. But remember, you chose this." He raised his hand as if to deliver a casual slap to the back of her head, the kind of playful violence that could be dismissed as harmless if challenged by authorities. It was perfectly calculated, demeaning enough to re-establish dominance, public enough to send a clear message, but subtle enough to avoid serious consequences. The slap never landed. Kira moved with the fluid precision of 8 years of training, ducking under Blake's extended arm while simultaneously stepping forward to eliminate his reach advantage. Her right hand shot upward in a perfect uppercut that caught him square under the jaw, snapping his head back and sending him stumbling into the table behind him. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and shocked exclamations as Blake crashed into chairs and lunch trays, his carefully maintained image of invincibility shattered in an instant. Students jumped to their feet, some backing away from the confrontation while others pressed closer for a better view. Trevor reacted first, stepping forward with his height advantage and longer reach. But Kira had spent years training against larger opponents, learning to use leverage and speed to overcome size disadvantages. She caught his extended arm and used his forward momentum to execute a textbook hip throw that sent him crashing to the floor with bone-jarring impact. Ashley screamed something about calling security, but Mason was already moving. His wrestling background gave him confidence in close-quarters combat, but he'd never faced someone trained in multiple martial arts disciplines. Kira slipped his grappling attempt and drove her knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over before following up with an elbow strike that dropped him to his knees. Derek backed away with his hands raised, his loyalty to the group evaporating in the face of actual consequences. "I wasn't part of this," he called out, seeking protection through distance and loud disavowal. Blake struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip and his eyes wide with shock and rage. "You crazy bitch! Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Kira stood in the center of the cleared space, her breathing controlled and her stance balanced. The nervous, invisible girl had vanished, replaced by someone who moved with dangerous confidence and perfect stillness. "I defended myself," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the cafeteria silence. "You tried to hit me, and I stopped you." "This isn't over," Blake snarled, pressing a napkin to his bleeding mouth. "You have no idea who you're messing with. My father—" "Your father isn't here," Kira interrupted with calm finality. "And if you ever touch me again, I'll put you in the hospital." The threat carried absolute conviction, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating inevitable consequences rather than making empty boasts. Students watching the confrontation could see the truth in her posture, the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable with violence. Trevor climbed slowly to his feet, his face pale and his earlier calculating demeanor replaced by genuine fear. "You're insane. We were just playing around, and you attacked us." "Playing around?" Kira's voice cut through his attempt at revisionist history. "You've been harassing me for months, cornering me in hallways, demanding I bow to you, threatening me daily. Today you tried to hit me in front of everyone, so I ended it." Her words carried clearly through the cafeteria, providing context for students who'd witnessed only the physical confrontation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as classmates processed this information, many remembering incidents they'd chosen to ignore or rationalize away. Mason remained on his knees, struggling to breathe normally after the solar plexus strike. Ashley hovered near the wall, her earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of actual consequences for their behavior. "You can't just assault people," she protested weakly. "There are rules." "Laws." "Self-defense," Kira replied simply. "Blake tried to hit me, and I defended myself. Everyone here saw it." The accuracy of that statement became clear as students around the cafeteria nodded or voiced agreement. Blake's attempted slap had been witnessed by dozens of people, providing clear justification for Kira's response, regardless of whatever had preceded it. "This is assault," Blake insisted, his voice cracking with desperation and humiliation. "I'm calling the police, pressing charges." "Go ahead," Kira said with calm confidence. "Explain to them how you cornered a smaller student and tried to hit her for refusing to bow to you. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic." The suggestion sent visible panic across Blake's face as he realized the implications. Any official investigation would examine the events leading up to the confrontation, exposing months of systematic harassment that could result in serious consequences for him and his friends. Mr. Peterson, the physics teacher, pushed through the crowd of students with the authoritative bearing of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "All right, everyone back to your tables. Show's over." He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in Blake's bloody lip, Trevor's disheveled appearance, Mason's continued difficulty breathing, and Kira standing calmly in the center of it all. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the no-nonsense tone that had made him effective at classroom management for 20 years. Multiple students began talking simultaneously, offering competing versions of events. But the consensus emerged clearly. Blake had attempted to strike Kira, and she had defended herself with overwhelming effectiveness. "Miss Valdez, Mr. Morrison, I need you to come with me to the principal's office," Peterson said with professional authority. "The rest of you, sit down and finish your lunch. This excitement is over." As they walked through the cafeteria toward the exit, Kira could feel hundreds of eyes following their progress. The whispered conversations that erupted in their wake would fuel school gossip for weeks, but the tone was markedly different from the mockery she'd grown accustomed to hearing about herself. "Did you see how fast she moved?" Blake never saw it coming. "I heard they've been messing with her for months. She dropped all three of them like it was nothing. Maybe someone finally stood up to those jerks." The walk to the administrative offices took less than 5 minutes, but Kira could feel the fundamental shift in her status at Westfield. She was no longer the invisible target who absorbed harassment in silence. For better or worse, she'd become someone who demanded respect through demonstrated capability. Principal Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, listened to their competing accounts with professional skepticism. Blake insisted he'd been attacked without provocation, while multiple student witnesses confirmed that he'd attempted to strike Kira first. "Miss Valdez," Martinez said after hearing the testimony, "I understand that Mr. Morrison attempted to hit you. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. He raised his hand to slap me, so I defended myself." "And you have martial arts training?" "Yes, ma'am. My uncle taught me self-defense when I was younger." Martinez turned to Blake with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Morrison, multiple witnesses confirm that you initiated physical contact. Is that accurate?" Blake's jaw worked silently as he struggled to find words that might salvage the situation. I was just messing around, playing. She totally overreacted. Playing? Martinez's voice carried ice-cold disapproval. You consider striking another student to be playing? I wasn't really going to hurt her. It was just a tap on the back. She went crazy and attacked me. A tap on the back that required ducking to avoid. Martinez's skepticism was evident. Mr. Morrison, this is your third disciplinary incident this semester. Combined with multiple reports of harassment targeting Miss Valdez, I'm afraid this constitutes a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. Blake's face went white as he realized the implications. Harassment? I never harassed anyone. We were just talking to her. Cornering a student in stairwells and demanding they bow to you constitutes harassment, Mr. Morrison, as does making comments about their family's economic status, their ethnicity, and their immigration status. The accuracy of Martinez's summary suggested that more students had been reporting incidents than Blake had realized. His campaign of systematic humiliation had been observed and documented, even if no action had been taken until now. I think a 3-day suspension will give you time to reflect on appropriate behavior toward your fellow students, Martinez continued. Your parents will be notified, and this incident will become part of your permanent record. Blake started to protest, but Martinez silenced him with a raised hand. The alternative is pressing charges for assault, Mr. Morrison. I suggest you accept the suspension gratefully and use the time to consider whether this is really the path you want to continue down. The threat of criminal charges effectively ended Blake's resistance. He slouched in his chair with the defeated posture of someone watching years of carefully constructed authority crumble in a single morning. Miss Valdez, Martinez said, turning her attention to Kira, while I understand that you were defending yourself, the level of force you used raises some concerns. 3 students required medical attention as a result of your response. Kira straightened in her chair, meeting the principal's gaze directly. I used the minimum force necessary to stop the attack and prevent them from continuing to assault me. My uncle taught me to end threats quickly and completely. I see. And this uncle, he has formal training in martial arts. Yes, ma'am. He's a Marine veteran who taught self-defense to kids in our neighborhood. He always emphasized that violence should be the last resort, but when you're forced to defend yourself, you should do it decisively. Martinez nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in that approach. Given the circumstances and the witness testimony confirming that Mr. Morrison initiated physical contact, I don't see grounds for disciplinary action against you. However, I want to be clear that fighting of any kind is not acceptable at this school. I understand, ma'am. I didn't want to fight anyone. I just wanted to be left alone. Which brings me to my next point. Why didn't you report the harassment earlier? We can't address problems we don't know about. Kira considered her response carefully. I didn't think anyone would believe me, and I was afraid that reporting it would make things worse. The admission hung in the air between them, highlighting the systemic failures that had allowed Blake's campaign to continue unchecked. Martinez's expression softened slightly as she recognized the implicit criticism of her school's culture. Miss Valdez, I want you to know that harassment of any kind is not tolerated at Westfield. If anyone bothers you again, anyone at all, I expect you to report it immediately. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. Good. You may return to class. Mr. Morrison, you'll remain here while we contact your parents. The walk back to the cafeteria felt surreal after the morning's events. Students watched her passage with mixtures of curiosity, respect, and wariness. She was no longer invisible, but the attention came with its own complexities. Ashley and Derek were nowhere to be seen when she retrieved her backpack from where she'd left it during the confrontation. Trevor sat at a corner table with an ice pack pressed to his ribs, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful avoidance of eye contact. Mason had apparently gone to the nurse's office, still dealing with breathing difficulties from the solar plexus strike. Lunch period ended without further incident, but the afternoon brought constant reminders of how completely the dynamics had shifted. Students who'd never acknowledged her existence suddenly offered tentative smiles or nods of recognition. Others maintained careful distance, uncertain how to interact with someone who demonstrated such decisive capability for violence. Her afternoon classes passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Teachers who'd grown accustomed to her quiet presence seemed unsure how to process reports of the morning's confrontation. Some offered subtle approval through encouraging comments or supportive gestures. Others maintained professional neutrality while clearly reassessing their assumptions about her character. The real test came after school, when she had to walk past the usual gathering spots where Blake's group normally congregated. The parking lot behind the gymnasium had served as their informal headquarters, a place where they could hold court away from direct administrative oversight. Today, the space felt different. Blake was nowhere to be seen, presumably still dealing with administrative consequences and parental conversations. Trevor sat alone on the concrete steps, his usual commanding presence diminished by obvious physical discomfort and social isolation. Ashley leaned against a car with several other students, but her earlier confidence had been replaced by nervous energy and frequent glances toward the school building. Mason remained absent, either still receiving medical attention or simply avoiding the scene of his humiliation. Derek hovered at the edge of the group, his status more precarious than ever. His association with Blake had provided protection and social standing, but those benefits came at the cost of being linked to the morning's debacle. Kira walked past them without incident, noting how conversations died as she approached and resumed in urgent whispers after she'd passed. The invisible barrier that had once made her a target now served as protection, born from demonstrated capability rather than social connections. The 2-mile walk home gave her time to process the day's events and their implications. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, revealing capabilities that would forever change how people viewed her. Uncle Miguel's training had served its purpose, but the consequences would ripple through every aspect of her life at Westfield. At home, her parents were waiting with expressions that mixed concern, confusion, and parental alarm. News of the cafeteria confrontation had apparently reached them through the efficient gossip networks that connected the plant where her father worked to the broader community. "Mija," her mother said as Kira entered the kitchen, "we got a call from school. They said there was some kind of fight." Her father looked up from his evening coffee with worried eyes. The supervisor at work heard something about police and suspensions. What happened? Kira settled at the kitchen table, choosing her words carefully. "Some students have been bothering me for a while. Today, one of them tried to hit me, so I defended myself." "Defended yourself how?" her mother asked with maternal intuition that sensed there was more to the story. "The way Uncle Miguel taught me. The boy who tried to hit me got hurt, along with his friends who were helping him." Carlos and Elena exchanged glances that communicated volumes about parental fears and protective instincts. They'd sent their daughter to school expecting normal teenage problems, not confrontations that resulted in injuries and administrative meetings. "Are you in trouble?" her father asked quietly. "The principal said I was defending myself and didn't do anything wrong, but the other students got suspended." Elena reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Were you hurt?" "No, Mama. They never touched me." The relief in her parents' faces was visible, but questions remained. They'd raised their daughter to be peaceful and respectful, avoiding conflicts that might draw unwanted attention to their family. This incident represented exactly the kind of visibility they'd hoped to avoid. "What happens now?" Carlos asked with the practical concern of someone who understood that actions had consequences. I don't know, Kira admitted. Everything's different now. People look at me differently. They know I can fight. Is that good or bad? Elena asked. Kira considered the question carefully. I don't know yet, but I'm tired of being afraid all the time. Tired of hiding who I am just to avoid trouble. Her parents nodded with understanding that came from their own experiences with feeling invisible and powerless. They'd spent years accepting small humiliations and casual dismissals because fighting back seemed too risky. Watching their daughter refuse to follow that same path created complex emotions they struggled to process. That evening, Kira called Uncle Miguel to report what had happened. His reaction was immediate and unambiguous. Good, he said with satisfaction. They picked the wrong person to mess with. How do you feel? Scared, she admitted, and relieved, and worried about what comes next. That's normal, Mija. Standing up for yourself is never easy, especially the first time. But you did exactly what I taught you. You waited until they forced you to fight, and then you ended it quickly and completely. 3 of them went down, Uncle Miguel. It was like everything you taught me just took over. 8 years of training doesn't disappear just because you haven't used it. Your body remembered what your mind tried to forget, and from what you're telling me, they won't bother you again. But what if there are consequences? What if this makes things worse somehow? Miguel's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd faced real violence and understood its aftermath. There are always consequences, Mija. The question is whether you can live with them. And from where I'm sitting, the consequences of letting them continue to humiliate you would have been much worse. The conversation helped settle some of her anxiety, but couldn't answer the fundamental question of what would happen when she returned to school the next day. Blake's suspension meant temporary reprieve from his direct harassment, but his social network remained intact and motivated for revenge. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual weather, storm clouds gathering over the mountains and a cold wind that promised afternoon rain. Kira dressed carefully, choosing clothes that projected confidence without appearing confrontational. The balance felt important somehow, acknowledging her changed status without seeming to invite further conflict. The walk to school took her past familiar landmarks that felt different now. The apartment complex where she lived no longer seemed like a refuge from school problems. She'd brought those worlds together through her actions, creating connections that couldn't be severed. Westfield Regional looked the same from the outside, but she could feel the change before she even entered the building. Students gathered in their usual morning clusters, but conversations died as she approached and resumed in urgent whispers after she'd passed. Her locker was surrounded by subtle but unmistakable signs of shifted social dynamics. Students who'd previously treated her as invisible now offered tentative nods or careful smiles. Others maintained deliberate distance, uncertain how to interact with someone who demonstrated such decisive capability for violence. Trevor leaned against a wall near the mathematics wing, his usual commanding presence diminished by obvious physical discomfort and social isolation. He watched her approach with calculation in his eyes, clearly working through options and possibilities. "Kira," he said as she passed, his voice carrying none of its usual cold authority. She stopped and turned to face him, noting how other students nearby tensed with anticipation of renewed conflict. "I wanted to apologize," he continued, the words clearly difficult for someone accustomed to dominance rather than submission. "What happened yesterday? Things got out of hand. Blake was wrong to try to hit you." The apology surprised her with its apparent sincerity, but Uncle Miguel's training had taught her to be wary of opponents who changed tactics suddenly. "Okay," she said simply, waiting to see what would follow. "I know you probably don't trust me, and I understand that, but I wanted you to know that some of us learned something yesterday, about respect, about going too far." Trevor's words carried the careful phrasing of someone who understood that their social standing hung in the balance. Blake's suspension had created a power vacuum within their group, and his response to yesterday's events would determine whether he could maintain any authority. "I hope so," Kira replied neutrally, unwilling to commit to forgiveness, but not rejecting the overture entirely. "Blake's not coming back until Friday," Trevor continued, offering information that might be strategically valuable. "His parents are not happy about yesterday, about the suspension and the circumstances." The implication was clear. Blake faced consequences at home as well as school, potentially limiting his ability to orchestrate immediate retaliation. "Thank you for telling me," Kira said, acknowledging the gesture without fully accepting it. Trevor nodded and moved away, leaving her to process this unexpected development. An apology from Blake's lieutenant suggested the group was fracturing under pressure, with individual members seeking to distance themselves from the campaign that had backfired so spectacularly. First period physics passed normally, with Mr. Peterson treating her no differently than he had before yesterday's events. His professional demeanor suggested administrative discretion about the incident, focusing on academic matters rather than dwelling on dramatic confrontations. But the real change became apparent during the break between classes. Students who'd never spoken to her before approached with tentative conversation attempts, clearly curious about her background and capabilities. "I heard you have martial arts training," said Jennifer Walsh, a quiet sophomore who'd always seemed nervous around Blake's group. "That's really cool. Where did you learn?" "My uncle taught me when I was younger," Kira replied, feeling awkward about the sudden attention. Would you maybe teach me some things? Just basic self-defense stuff." The request caught her off guard. She'd spent months trying to become invisible, avoiding any attention that might make her a target. Now students were seeking her out, wanting to learn from her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm not really a teacher." "You don't have to be a formal teacher," Jennifer insisted. "Just someone who knows how to defend themselves. There are other people who might be interested too." The conversation was interrupted by the bell, but it planted seeds of possibility that Kira hadn't considered. Her decision to fight back had revealed capabilities that could benefit others, creating opportunities to transform her defensive skills into something more constructive. Lunch period brought the day's most significant test. The cafeteria where yesterday's confrontation had occurred buzzed with nervous energy as students anticipated potential drama. Kira's entrance drew immediate attention, with conversations pausing as classmates watched to see what would happen. Ashley sat at a corner table with several other students, her usual confident demeanor replaced by careful watchfulness. She'd clearly spent considerable time rebuilding her social position after yesterday's humiliation, rallying supporters who viewed the incident as an attack on established hierarchies. Mason remained absent, reportedly still dealing with breathing problems from the solar plexus strike. His absence served as a visible reminder of the confrontation's consequences, reinforcing the new dynamic through physical evidence. Derek hovered near the vending machines, his uncertain status within the group creating obvious anxiety. He'd managed to avoid direct consequences by backing away during the fight, but his association with the aggressors left him in social limbo. Kira purchased her lunch and settled at a table near the windows, choosing a position that provided clear sightlines while avoiding the central areas where yesterday's drama had unfolded. She'd barely started eating when she was joined by unexpected company. "Mind if we sit here?" asked Marcus Chen, a junior who'd never spoken to her before, but whose academic reputation preceded him. He was accompanied by two other students she recognized but didn't know personally. "Sure," she said, genuinely surprised by the request. Marcus settled across from her with the careful movements of someone weighing their words carefully. "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday," Blake and his friends have been making life miserable for a lot of people, and nobody ever stood up to them before. I just defended myself, Kira replied, uncomfortable with being cast as some kind of hero. Maybe, said Angela Martinez, one of Marcus's companions, but you showed everyone that they're not untouchable, that their behavior has consequences. The third student, David Park, nodded agreement. My younger brother's been afraid to come to school because of stuff like what they were doing to you. Yesterday changed that. Now he knows that bullies can be stopped. Kira found herself at the center of conversations she'd never expected to have, with students sharing stories of their own encounters with Blake's group and expressing gratitude for her actions. The attention felt overwhelming after months of carefully maintained invisibility. Some of us have been talking, Marcus continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, about forming a group. Nothing aggressive or violent, just students who look out for each other. Make sure harassment gets reported and stopped before it escalates. Like a support network, Angela added, people who have each other's backs when bullies try their intimidation tactics. The idea intrigued Kira despite her natural caution. She'd spent so long fighting her battles alone that the concept of mutual support felt both appealing and foreign. What would something like that involve? She asked carefully. Documentation, David replied, with the precision of someone who'd thought this through thoroughly. Recording incidents, gathering witnesses, making sure administrators can't ignore patterns of behavior. And intervention, Marcus added. Not fighting, but making sure targeted students aren't isolated, that there are people willing to speak up when they see harassment happening. The proposal represented everything she'd wished for during her months of silent suffering. Allies who would refuse to look away, systems that would prevent isolated victims from facing systematic campaigns alone. I think it's a good idea, she said finally, but I'm probably not the right person to organize something like that. People see me as someone who solves problems with violence now. Which is exactly why you should be involved, Angela insisted. You proved that victims don't have to stay victims. That's important for people to see. The lunch conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical details about organizing student support networks and creating accountability systems for harassment. By the time the bell rang, Kira found herself tentatively committed to attending an organizational meeting that weekend. The afternoon brought additional signs of shifted dynamics. Students who'd previously participated in Blake's harassment campaigns through laughter and encouragement now maintained careful distance from her. Others offered subtle gestures of support, a smile in the hallway, a seat saved in study hall, small acknowledgements of changed allegiances. After school, she encountered Ashley near the student parking lot. The confrontation felt inevitable given the morning's careful avoidance, and Kira braced herself for whatever version of retaliation the other girl had planned. "You think you're so smart," Ashley said without preamble, her voice carrying bitter resentment. "Taking down Blake and acting like some kind of hero. But you have no idea what you've started." Kira stopped walking and turned to face her, noting how Ashley had positioned herself near other students who might serve as witnesses or potential allies. "I didn't start anything," Kira replied calmly. "Blake tried to hit me, and I defended myself. Everything else is consequences of his choices." "His choices?" Ashley's voice rose with indignation. "You attacked him. You put 3 people in the hospital." "The nurse's office," Kira corrected mildly, "and only because they were harassing me and Blake tried to assault me in front of everyone." The accuracy of that statement deflated some of Ashley's outrage, reminding her that multiple witnesses had confirmed Kira's version of events. "You could have just walked away," Ashley insisted, grasping for moral high ground. "But instead you chose violence, you chose to hurt people." I chose to defend myself after months of harassment that you participated in, Kira replied with growing firmness. I chose to stop being a victim. The words carried enough conviction to draw supportive nods from nearby students, many of whom had witnessed or heard about the systematic campaign that had preceded yesterday's confrontation. Ashley recognized that public opinion was shifting against her and changed tactics. This isn't over. Blake's family has connections in this town. His father knows people. You think one fight solves everything, but you have no idea what kind of problems you've created for yourself. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, social and economic retaliation that could affect her family's position in the community. Kira felt a chill of fear as she realized the potential consequences of challenging established power structures. But Uncle Miguel's voice echoed in her memory. Bullies count on fear to maintain control. The moment you show them you're not afraid, their power starts cracking. Let them try, she said with quiet confidence. Yesterday taught me that standing up for myself works better than hiding ever did. Ashley's face flushed with frustration as her intimidation attempt failed to achieve its desired effect. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Kira to process the implications of ongoing conflict with families who possessed real social and economic power. The walk home took her through neighborhoods that reflected the community's economic stratification. Blake's family lived in colonial manor, where houses sat on acre lots behind wrought iron gates. Ashley's family owned a sprawling ranch-style home in Westfield Heights, complete with circular driveway and 3-car garage. Her own apartment complex sat on the other side of the railway tracks, where rental units housed families who worked in service industries that kept the prosperous parts of town functioning. The contrast reminded her that yesterday's victory had been personal rather than systemic. She'd won a battle, but the war involved forces much larger than high school social dynamics. At home, her parents were waiting with updates on community reactions to yesterday's events. The gossip networks that connected workplaces and neighborhoods had been buzzing with competing versions of the cafeteria confrontation. People at the plant are talking, her father said, as they gathered for dinner. Some think you did the right thing, others are worried about complications. What kind of complications? Kira asked, though she suspected she already knew. The Morrison family has influence, her mother explained gently. Blake's father sits on several boards around town. His mother runs charities that provide contracts to businesses like the one where I work. The implication was clear. Challenging Blake might result in economic retaliation against her family. Her parents' employment could be threatened through quiet pressure applied by people who had never heard of Kira, but who shared social connections with the families she'd embarrassed. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't think about how this might affect you. Carlos reached across to squeeze her shoulder. You defended yourself, Mija. We're proud of you for that. But we also need to be smart about what comes next. What do you mean? We mean that we support you completely, Elena said firmly. But we also need to be prepared for people who might try to hurt our family because they can't hurt you directly. The conversation continued through dinner as they discussed practical preparations for potential retaliation. Her father's position at the plant was still probationary, making him vulnerable to pressure from supervisors who might receive calls from influential community members. Her mother's cleaning contracts could be cancelled without explanation by clients who moved in the same social circles as Blake's family. But alongside the practical concerns came expressions of pride and support that surprised Kira with their intensity. Her parents had spent years accepting small humiliations to protect their family's stability, and watching their daughter refuse to follow that same path triggered complex emotions. You did what we never could, her father said as they cleared the dinner dishes. You stood up for yourself when someone tried to hurt you. That takes courage. But it also has consequences, her mother added gently. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. That evening, Kira called Uncle Miguel to update him on developments and seek advice about navigating the complex aftermath of her decision to fight back. The families have power, she explained after describing the day's events. Blake's father has connections that could hurt Papa's job or Mama's contracts. I won yesterday, but they might win in the long run. Miguel's response carried the wisdom of someone who'd faced institutional power and understood its reach. Listen carefully, Mija. Bullies like Blake come from families of bullies. They're used to using indirect pressure because they can't handle direct confrontation. But that also means they're vulnerable in ways they don't expect. What do you mean? They rely on people being afraid to fight back. When someone like you stands up to them, it exposes their weakness to everyone watching. Other people start getting ideas about standing up too. But what if they go after my parents? What if Papa loses his job? Then we deal with that if it happens. But don't let fear of what might happen keep you from doing what's right. And remember, you're not alone in this. Those students who sat with you today, they have families too. Some of those families might have more influence than you think. The conversation helped put the day's events in perspective, reminding her that choosing to fight back had revealed allies as well as enemies. The student support network Marcus had proposed might represent the beginning of broader changes in how harassment was addressed at Westfield. Wednesday morning brought the first test of whether Blake's allies would attempt retaliation in his absence. Kira approached the school with heightened awareness, noting which students watched her arrival and how they positioned themselves in relation to her movements. The morning passed without incident, but she could feel undercurrents of tension in hallway conversations and classroom dynamics. Blake's suspension had created a power vacuum that various factions were attempting to fill, with different groups advancing competing narratives about Monday's confrontation. Some students cast her as a hero who'd finally stood up to systematic bullying. Others portrayed her as a violent outsider who'd attacked popular students without provocation. The truth lay somewhere between these extremes, but public opinion was still forming based on incomplete information and tribal loyalties. The lunch period brought unexpected developments. Jennifer Walsh approached her table with obvious nervousness, carrying a folded piece of paper that she handed over without explanation. "Some of us have been talking," Jennifer said quietly, "about what you mentioned yesterday, about self-defense training. We wrote down names of people who might be interested." Kira unfolded the paper to find a list of nearly 20 students, including several she recognized as previous targets of harassment campaigns. The list represented a cross-section of the school's social outcasts and vulnerable populations: transfer students, academic overachievers, students from lower-income families, and others who'd learned to make themselves invisible to avoid unwanted attention. "This is a lot of people," Kira said, feeling overwhelmed by the implied responsibility. "There are more who didn't want their names written down," Jennifer added. "People who are interested but scared of being associated with something that might get them in trouble." The response suggested that Blake's harassment campaign had affected far more students than she'd realized. Her decision to fight back had apparently inspired others to consider alternatives to silent endurance. "I'm not qualified to teach this many people," Kira protested. "I learned from my uncle, but I'm not an instructor." "You don't have to be perfect," Jennifer insisted. "You just have to know more than we do. And after Monday, everyone knows you can handle yourself." Marcus Chen appeared at their table with the timing of someone who'd been watching for the right moment to approach. "We've been thinking about the discussion yesterday, about forming a support network. This could be part of that. Practical skills training alongside the documentation and reporting systems." The conversation attracted additional students who'd been listening from nearby tables. Soon, Kira found herself at the center of an impromptu planning session involving logistics, locations, and schedules for informal self-defense instruction. The community center has rooms we could rent, suggested Angela Martinez. My mom works there part-time and says they're pretty reasonable for student groups. We'd need basic equipment, added David Park. Mats, maybe some protective gear for sparring practice. And we'd need to be careful about insurance and liability issues, Marcus warned, with characteristic thoroughness. If someone gets hurt during training, there could be legal problems. Kira listened to the enthusiastic planning with growing amazement. 3 days earlier, she'd been an invisible target, avoiding attention at all costs. Now students were organizing around skills and knowledge she'd never intended to share publicly. "Let me talk to my uncle," she said finally. "He knows more about teaching this stuff safely. If he thinks it's a good idea, maybe we can start with basic techniques and see how it goes." The agreement sparked excited discussions about potential schedules and training goals. Students who'd spent months or years feeling powerless against harassment campaigns suddenly saw possibilities for taking control of their own safety. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge. As she walked toward her locker after last period, Kira noticed Trevor approaching with deliberate purpose. His earlier apologetic demeanor had been replaced by calculating assessment, suggesting he'd spent considerable time thinking about their previous conversation. "I wanted to follow up on our talk yesterday," he said without preamble, "about Blake being wrong and things getting out of hand." "Okay," Kira replied cautiously, noting how other students nearby seemed to be listening without appearing to do so. "The thing is, Blake's coming back Friday, and he's not happy about how things ended up. His parents grounded him until graduation, and his father's threatening to pull support for college applications if there are any more incidents." The information revealed more about Blake's home situation than Trevor had probably intended. Apparently, his parents had taken the suspension seriously, implementing consequences that extended well beyond the school's official punishment. "So he's learned his lesson?" Kira asked with mild skepticism. "That's complicated," Trevor admitted with unusual honesty. "Blake doesn't like losing, especially not in public in front of everyone. He's the kind of person who holds grudges and looks for opportunities to settle scores. Are you warning me about something specific?" Trevor hesitated before answering, clearly struggling with competing loyalties and self-interest calculations. "I'm saying that Blake isn't the type to let this go. But I'm also saying that some of us understand why you did what you did, and we're not interested in getting hurt again over his wounded pride." The statement represented a careful political position, acknowledging Blake's likely desire for revenge while distancing himself from future retaliation attempts. Trevor was apparently trying to preserve his own safety while maintaining some connection to the group's remaining power structure. "I appreciate the warning," Kira said diplomatically. "But I hope Blake understands that I didn't start this fight. I just finished it." "I think he understands that his approach didn't work," Trevor replied carefully. "But understanding and accepting are different things." The conversation ended without resolution, leaving Kira to wonder whether Trevor's warning represented genuine concern or psychological manipulation designed to maintain her anxiety about potential retaliation. That afternoon's walk home took her past Colonial Manor, where Blake's family lived behind gates and carefully maintained landscaping. She found herself wondering what conversations had taken place in that house after Monday's suspension. What threats or ultimatums had been delivered by parents whose authority had been challenged through their son's public humiliation? At home, her parents had news that added complexity to an already complicated situation. Her father's supervisor at the plant had mentioned hearing about some kind of trouble at the high school involving Carlos's daughter. The comment had been delivered casually, but the implication was clear. Workplace gossip had connected Monday's incident to their family. "He didn't seem angry," her father explained over dinner, "more curious than anything else, but he knows about it now." "What did you tell him?" Kira asked. "The truth, That some boys were bothering you and you defended yourself when one of them tried to hit you. He seemed to think that was reasonable. Her mother added her own update from the office building where she worked night shifts. Mrs. Peterson mentioned it today. She heard about it from someone at the school board meeting. She wanted to know if you were okay. The report suggested that news of the confrontation was spreading through adult networks as well as student gossip. Kira's actions had apparently become a topic of community conversation, with different groups forming opinions based on second-hand information and existing prejudices. "Are people taking sides?" she asked. "It seems like it," Elena replied thoughtfully. "Some think you did exactly what you should have done. Others think students shouldn't be fighting at school, regardless of the circumstances. And some," Carlos added with careful neutrality, "think families like ours should keep their heads down and avoid causing trouble." The last comment stung because it reflected real tensions within communities where economic vulnerability created pressure to avoid anything that might be perceived as challenging established hierarchies. Standing up to Blake hadn't just been about defending herself, it had been about refusing to accept a subordinate position that some people considered appropriate for her family's social status. Thursday morning brought Blake's allies' first organized attempt at retaliation. Ashley had apparently spent the previous evening coordinating a campaign designed to isolate Kira socially and undermine the support she'd been building. The attack began with social media posts that portrayed Monday's confrontation as an unprovoked assault by a violent transfer student against popular kids who were just trying to be friendly. The posts included carefully edited photos and selective quotes designed to generate sympathy for Blake's group while demonizing Kira as a dangerous outsider. By lunchtime, printed flyers were appearing around school with inflammatory headlines like "Violence is not the answer" and "Protect our students from dangerous behavior." The materials avoided direct accusations that might trigger administrative intervention, but clearly implied that Kira represented a threat to school safety. The campaign might have been effective if it had launched immediately after Monday's incident, before competing narratives could establish themselves. But by Thursday, too many students had witnessed the harassment campaign that preceded the confrontation. Ashley's attempt at revisionist history clashed with first-hand knowledge of Blake's systematic targeting. "This is ridiculous," Jennifer Walsh said, as she showed Kira one of the flyers during lunch. "Everyone knows Blake and his friends were harassing you for months. These things make it sound like you attacked them for no reason." Marcus Chen had saved several of the social media posts before they could be deleted or modified. "Look at this," he said, showing his phone screen to the growing group of students gathered around Kira's table. "They're trying to make Blake look like the victim." The ham-fisted propaganda effort was backfiring spectacularly, generating backlash from students who viewed it as insulting to their intelligence and memory. Ashley's attempt to rehabilitate Blake's image was instead reminding people of incidents they might have preferred to forget. "We should document all of this," Angela Martinez suggested, with the systematic thinking that had made her effective in student government. "Screenshots, photos of the flyers, everything. It shows how they operate when they can't intimidate someone directly." The suggestion sparked enthusiastic responses from students who'd spent years watching similar campaigns target other victims. Ashley's retaliation effort was providing a perfect case study in harassment tactics, complete with evidence that could be used to educate others about recognizing and countering such approaches. By the end of lunch period, Kira found herself surrounded by an informal coalition of students who were treating Ashley's propaganda campaign as a learning opportunity rather than a threat. The support felt surreal after months of isolation, but also created new responsibilities she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. The afternoon brought an unexpected summons to Principal Martinez's office. Kira assumed it was related to the flyer campaign and prepared explanations about her non-involvement in creating or distributing materials that violated school policies. Instead, she found herself facing a different kind of conversation entirely. "Miss Valdez," Martinez said as she settled into the chair across from the principal's desk, "I've been hearing interesting things about activities you may be organizing. Something about self-defense instruction for students?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected discussions about Ashley's retaliation campaign, not queries about the informal training sessions that were still in preliminary planning stages. "It's just an idea," she said carefully. "Some students asked if I could teach them basic self-defense techniques. We haven't actually done anything yet." "I see. And these would be organized through the school?" "No, ma'am. We were thinking about using the community center, outside of school hours and off-school property." Martinez nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting she was working through policy implications rather than preparing to shut down the idea. "The reason I'm asking is that several parents have contacted me about their children's interest in this proposed training. Some are very supportive, others have concerns about students learning fighting techniques." Kira felt her stomach clench as she realized the conversation was moving into territory where administrative decisions could override student initiative. "It wouldn't be about fighting," she said quickly. "My uncle always emphasized that self-defense is about avoiding violence when possible and escaping safely when necessary. The physical techniques are just for situations where someone doesn't have other choices." "Like the situation you faced on Monday?" "Yes, ma'am, exactly like that." Martinez leaned back in her chair, studying Kira with the calculating gaze of someone weighing multiple factors and constituencies. "I have to tell you, Miss Valdez, that Monday's incident has created discussions among parents and school board members. Some view your actions as appropriate self-defense that should be commended. Others worry about escalating violence and the message we send by seeming to approve of fighting." The admission revealed political pressures Kira hadn't fully considered. Her decision to defend herself had apparently become a flashpoint for broader debates about school safety, disciplinary policies, and appropriate responses to harassment. "I never wanted to fight anyone," she said quietly. "I just wanted to be left alone." "I believe that," Martinez replied with surprising warmth. "And I want you to know that this school's official position is that you acted appropriately in defending yourself when threatened with assault. However, we also need to be mindful of how we handle the aftermath of that incident." "Does that mean we can't organize the self-defense training?" "It means we need to be very careful about how such training is structured and supervised. If you're serious about moving forward with this idea, I'd like to meet with you, your parents, and whoever would be providing instruction. We need to ensure that any training emphasizes conflict avoidance and appropriate responses rather than encouraging confrontational behavior." The response was more positive than Kira had dared hope. Instead of shutting down the idea entirely, Martinez seemed willing to work within official channels to support student safety initiatives. "My uncle could probably come up from New Mexico," Kira offered. "He's the one who taught me, and he has experience working with community programs." "That would be excellent. Let's set up a meeting for next week to discuss details and safety protocols. In the meantime, please make sure any planning remains preliminary until we can establish appropriate guidelines." The conversation ended with cautious optimism about possibilities for turning her defensive skills into something that could benefit other vulnerable students. Walking back to class, Kira reflected on how completely her life had changed in less than a week. Friday morning brought Blake's return to school, and the day everyone had been anticipating with varying degrees of anxiety and curiosity. His suspension had created a power vacuum and generated competing narratives about Monday's confrontation. His reappearance would either reassert his previous authority or confirm that the dynamics had shifted permanently. Kira arrived early and positioned herself strategically near her locker, wanting to observe Blake's arrival rather than be caught off guard by unexpected encounters. The hallway filled gradually with students who seemed unusually alert, conversations carrying undertones of anticipation that suggested widespread awareness of potential drama. Blake appeared precisely 7 minutes before the first period bell, flanked by Trevor and accompanied by Derek, who maintained nervous distance from the group's reformed core. Ashley was notably absent, apparently choosing to let Blake test the waters before committing to visible support. The most striking change was in Blake himself. Gone was the casual confidence that had marked his previous appearances. He moved carefully, almost tentatively, like someone who was no longer certain of his reception. His eyes swept the hallway constantly, assessing reactions and calculating responses. When his gaze fell on Kira, both students and nearby adults seemed to hold their breath. The moment stretched with tension as everyone waited to see how the confrontation that had redefined school dynamics would be acknowledged or addressed. Blake stared at her for several seconds, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to pass easily. Finally, he looked away and continued toward his own locker without speaking or approaching. The anticlimactic interaction somehow felt more significant than another confrontation would have been. Blake's failure to acknowledge their previous encounter or assert any authority over her movements represented a tacit admission that the old dynamic was over. "Did you see that?" Jennifer Walsh whispered as Blake disappeared down the hallway. He looked scared. "Good," Marcus Chen replied with satisfaction. "Maybe now he'll know how it feels." The morning passed without further incident, but Kira could feel the changed atmosphere throughout the building. Students moved differently, talked differently, carried themselves with subtle shifts that reflected altered power structures and social hierarchies. At lunch, she joined the growing group of students who'd begun gathering around discussions of the self-defense training and support network initiatives. The conversation had evolved beyond preliminary planning into detailed logistics about schedules, locations, and curriculum development. "My uncle can come up next Friday for the meeting with Principal Martinez," she reported. "He's excited about the possibility of working with a school-based program." "That's great," Angela Martinez replied. "My mom confirmed that the community center has space available on Saturday mornings. They're willing to work with us on rates if we can demonstrate that it's an educational program." Marcus had been researching liability insurance and safety protocols, approaching the project with characteristic thoroughness. "I found examples of similar programs in other schools. The key seems to be emphasizing personal safety and conflict avoidance rather than combat techniques." David Park had been polling potential participants about their interests and concerns. "Most people want to learn basic awareness skills and escape techniques. Only a few are interested in actual fighting methods." The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Blake approached their table with obvious reluctance, his usual commanding presence replaced by something closer to supplication. "Can I talk to you?" he asked Kira, his voice carefully neutral. "Privately?" The request surprised everyone at the table, including Kira herself. After a week of wondering how Blake would respond to his public humiliation, this tentative approach felt anticlimactic and somehow more concerning than aggressive confrontation would have been. "We can talk here," she replied, unwilling to be isolated with someone whose intentions remained unclear. Blake glanced around the table at the students who'd become her informal support network, clearly uncomfortable with the audience, but recognizing his lack of leverage to demand privacy. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, the words obviously difficult for someone unaccustomed to admitting fault. "For Monday, for what happened." The apology hung in the air as students processed this unexpected development, Blake Morrison, who'd spent years treating apologies as signs of weakness, was publicly acknowledging wrongdoing to someone he'd systematically harassed. "Okay," Kira said simply, waiting to see what would follow. "I know sorry doesn't fix anything," Blake continued, his carefully prepared words suggesting significant practice or coaching. "But I wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did, and I wanted to promise that there won't be any retaliation or further problems from me or my friends." The statement was clearly designed to be overheard, creating witnesses to commitments that could be referenced if future incidents occurred. Someone, probably his parents or school administrators, had obviously impressed upon Blake the importance of public accountability for his promises. "I appreciate that," Kira replied diplomatically. "I also wanted to say that if anyone else gives you trouble, anyone at all, you can let me know. I have influence with a lot of people here, and I can make sure harassment stops." The offer represented a complete reversal of their previous dynamic, transforming Blake from primary antagonist to potential protector. It also revealed sophisticated political calculation, positioning himself as reformed and helpful rather than simply defeated. "Thank you," Kira said, genuinely surprised by the unexpected alliance offer. Blake nodded awkwardly and started to leave, then turned back with obvious reluctance. "One more thing. I heard about the self-defense training idea. If you need help with organization or getting school approval, my family has connections that might be useful." The suggestion drew surprised looks from students around the table who were still processing Blake's transformation from antagonist to advocate. "That's actually very helpful," Marcus Chen said carefully. "We're meeting with Principal Martinez next week to discuss details." "Let me know if you need letters of support or anything like that," Blake replied. "My mom sits on committees with several school board members." After he left, the table sat in stunned silence as students processed what they'd just witnessed. "Did Blake Morrison just offer to help us organize self-defense training?" Angela asked with disbelief. "I think he's trying to rehabilitate his image," David suggested. "Show that he's learned from what happened and become a better person. Or his parents told him to clean up his act or face consequences at home," Jennifer added, with cynical accuracy. Kira found herself feeling oddly unsettled by Blake's apparent transformation. His aggressive harassment had been straightforward to handle once she'd decided to fight back. This helpful, apologetic version created complications she wasn't sure how to navigate. "What do you think?" Marcus asked her directly. "Do you trust him?" The question required careful consideration. Blake's apology and offers of assistance could represent genuine change driven by consequences and reflection. They could also be tactical maneuvers designed to restore his reputation while positioning him for future retaliation when circumstances were more favorable. "I think he's scared," she said finally. "His parents probably told him that any more problems would result in serious consequences. So right now, helping me probably seems safer than opposing me." "But that could change if his situation changes," Angela observed. "Exactly. So we accept his help if it's useful, but we don't depend on it or trust him completely." The pragmatic approach satisfied the group's concerns while keeping options open for beneficial cooperation. Blake's offers of assistance could accelerate their self-defense program and provide political cover with administrators and parents. The afternoon passed without further drama, but Kira could feel fundamental shifts in how other students related to her presence. The invisible girl who'd absorbed harassment in silence had been replaced by someone who commanded respect through demonstrated capability and growing social connections. After school, she walked the familiar route home with renewed appreciation for how completely her circumstances had changed. The same streets and buildings looked different when viewed from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. At home, her parents were waiting with expressions that mixed pride, concern, and parental bewilderment at their daughter's rapid transformation from target to leader. "We got another call from school," her mother said as Kira settled at the kitchen table. "Principal Martinez wants to meet with us Monday about some kind of training program you're organizing." "It's the self-defense instruction we talked about," Kira explained. "Students who want to learn basic safety skills. The principal wants to make sure it's done properly, with adult supervision and safety protocols." Carlos and Elena exchanged glances that communicated volumes about parental concerns and protective instincts. "This is moving very fast, Mija," her father said gently. "A week ago you were trying to avoid attention, and now you're organizing programs and meeting with administrators." "I know. It's overwhelming sometimes, but I think it's important. There are other students who feel as powerless as I did, and maybe we can help them." Elena reached across to squeeze her daughter's hand. "We're proud of you for wanting to help others, but we also want to make sure you're not taking on more responsibility than you can handle." The conversation continued through dinner as they discussed practical implications of the self-defense program and her evolving role within it. Her parents' concerns were valid. She'd gone from invisible victim to community organizer in less than a week, and the psychological adjustment was significant. That evening, she called Uncle Miguel to update him on the week's developments and seek guidance about the upcoming meeting with school administrators. "They want to meet with you?" Miguel's voice carried surprise and approval. "That's a good sign, Mija. It means they're taking this seriously, instead of just trying to shut it down." "I'm nervous about it," she admitted. "What if I say something wrong? What if they decide it's too risky?" "Then you tell them the truth, that students deserve to feel safe, and sometimes that means knowing how to protect themselves. But you also emphasize that real self-defense is about avoiding dangerous situations whenever possible." Blake apologized today, in front of everyone, and offered to help with the program. Miguel's chuckle carried understanding of complex political dynamics. "Smart kid. He figured out that being your ally is safer than being your enemy. Just remember that people can change tactics without changing fundamental character. I don't trust him completely, but his help could be useful." "Exactly right. Use what helps you achieve good goals, but don't mistake temporary cooperation for permanent friendship." The conversation helped clarify her thinking about the upcoming challenges and opportunities. Monday's meeting would determine whether the self-defense program could move forward with official support or would need to operate independently through community organizations. Saturday brought the first informal gathering of students interested in the training program. They met at the community center in a small classroom that Angela's mother had reserved for 2 hours. No actual instruction took place, but the session allowed participants to meet each other and discuss goals and expectations. Nearly 30 students attended, representing a cross-section of Westfield's vulnerable populations: transfer students, academic overachievers, kids from lower-income families, and others who'd learned to make themselves invisible to avoid unwanted attention. "I think we should start with situational awareness," suggested a sophomore named Rachel, who'd been targeted by a different harassment campaign earlier in the year. "Learning to recognize when trouble is developing and how to get away before it escalates." "Basic physical techniques too," added James, a senior who'd been managing bullying problems since middle school. "Sometimes you can't avoid confrontation, and you need to know how to defend yourself effectively." The discussion revealed sophisticated understanding of harassment dynamics and self-defense principles among students who'd been forced to develop survival strategies through experience. Many had insights that would be valuable for others facing similar challenges. Kira found herself taking mental notes about effective curriculum approaches while marveling at the intelligence and resilience of her potential students. These weren't helpless victims seeking rescue. They were capable people who needed skills and confidence to handle difficult situations. "The key is going to be practicing scenarios," she said, when the discussion turned to training methods. "Not just learning techniques in isolation, but understanding how to apply them when you're scared or surprised." The meeting ended with enthusiastic commitment to moving forward, pending approval from school administrators. Students exchanged contact information and began forming study groups to research self-defense principles and legal aspects of protective actions. Sunday evening, Kira spent hours preparing for Monday's meeting with Principal Martinez and her parents. She outlined program goals, safety protocols, and educational objectives that would appeal to administrators while addressing legitimate concerns about liability and student safety. The preparation process helped her realize how much she'd learned about leadership and program development in a single week. The invisible girl who'd avoided all attention had been forced to become someone who could advocate effectively for herself and others. Monday morning brought crisp autumn air and clear skies that seemed to promise positive developments. Kira dressed carefully for the administrative meeting, choosing clothes that projected seriousness and responsibility while remaining true to her personal style. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, requiring her to miss second period chemistry. Principal Martinez had arranged for her parents to arrive early so they could discuss concerns privately before the group session. At 9:45, she presented herself at the main office where her parents were already waiting with expressions that mixed pride and nervousness. They dressed carefully too, understanding that this meeting could influence their daughter's future opportunities as well as the broader program. "Miss Valdez," Principal Martinez said as she emerged from her office, "thank you for coming. And Mr. and Mrs. Valdez, I appreciate you taking time from work to join us." They followed her into the conference room where she'd arranged chairs around a small table that would facilitate discussion rather than formal presentation. The casual setup suggested openness to collaborative problem-solving rather than administrative judgment. "Before we talk about the self-defense program," Martinez began, "I want to address last week's incident and its aftermath. Miss Valdez, how are you feeling about everything that's happened?" The question caught Kira off guard with its personal focus. She'd expected discussions about policies and procedures, not check-ins about her emotional well-being. "It's been overwhelming," she said honestly. "Everything changed so quickly. A week ago I was trying to be invisible, and now students are looking to me for leadership I'm not sure I'm qualified to provide." "That's a very mature perspective," Martinez replied with approval. "Leadership often emerges from unexpected circumstances, and the most effective leaders are those who question their own readiness." Elena leaned forward with maternal concern. "We worry that she's taking on too much responsibility too quickly. The attention, the expectations from other students, it's a lot for anyone to handle." "I share that concern," Martinez agreed, "which is why I wanted to discuss how we can support this initiative appropriately. If we're going to move forward with a self-defense program, it needs proper adult supervision and institutional backing." Carlos spoke up with the practical concerns of someone who understood workplace dynamics. "What kind of liability issues are involved? If students get hurt during training, who's responsible?" "Excellent question," Martinez replied. "That's one of several issues we need to address. Insurance coverage, instructor qualifications, safety protocols, parental consent. There are multiple factors to consider." The conversation continued for 45 minutes, covering practical aspects of program development that Kira hadn't fully considered. Martinez's questions revealed sophisticated understanding of educational programming and risk management that made the discussion feel more like professional consultation than administrative oversight. "Here's what I'd like to propose," Martinez said as the formal meeting concluded. "Let's develop this as a pilot program for the spring semester. We'll work with the district's insurance provider to ensure proper coverage, require certified instructor supervision, and implement comprehensive safety protocols." The proposal exceeded Kira's most optimistic expectations. Instead of grudging permission for off-campus activities, Martinez was offering full institutional support for an official school program. "That would be amazing," she said with genuine excitement. "But what about parents who oppose the idea, or school board members who think it sends the wrong message?" "Let me worry about the politics," Martinez replied with confidence. "The educational merit of the program is clear, and your uncle's military background provides credibility for instruction. We'll position this as character development and personal safety education rather than fighting instruction." After her parents left to return to work, Martinez asked Kira to remain for additional discussion about her evolving role at Westfield. "You've become a very visible figure in a very short time," Martinez observed. "That brings opportunities and responsibilities you may not have anticipated." "I never wanted to be visible," Kira admitted. "I just wanted to be left alone." "I understand, but circumstances have changed, and you have influence now. How you use that influence will affect not just your own experience, but the experiences of other students who look up to you." The comment reminded Kira of conversations with Uncle Miguel about the responsibilities that came with capability and knowledge. Having skills meant having obligations to use them appropriately and help others when possible. "I want to help," she said finally. "I remember how hopeless I felt when Blake and his friends were harassing me every day. If we can prevent other students from feeling that way, it's worth the complications." "Good. But remember that you're still a student yourself. Don't let leadership responsibilities interfere with your own education and development." The meeting ended with specific assignments for program development and timeline for implementation. Kira left the office feeling both excited about possibilities and daunted by the scope of what they were undertaking. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of classes where she struggled to concentrate on academic material while processing the morning's developments. Her notebook margins filled with program ideas and implementation strategies that had nothing to do with calculus or American history. At lunch, she updated the growing circle of students who'd become invested in the self-defense program's success. Their enthusiasm about official school support was infectious, generating excited discussions about curriculum possibilities and training schedules. "This is going to be huge," Marcus said with satisfaction. "A real program with proper facilities and instructor support. We could help dozens of students learn to protect themselves." "And it sends a message," Angela added, "that the school takes harassment seriously and wants to give students tools to handle it." Jennifer raised a practical concern that others had been thinking about. "What about students like Blake who might want to join? Do we let harassers learn the same techniques we're teaching their victims?" The question sparked intense debate about program eligibility and screening procedures. Some argued for inclusive policies that could potentially reform bullies through education about harassment impacts. Others favored selective admission that prioritized vulnerable students who needed protection most. "I think we have to be inclusive," Kira said finally. "If we start judging who deserves to learn self-defense, we become the gatekeepers we're trying to protect people from. But we also need clear expectations about using skills responsibly." The compromise position satisfied most concerns while maintaining program integrity. They could welcome all participants while establishing behavioral standards that emphasized protection over aggression. That afternoon brought an unexpected encounter with Ashley, who approached Kira's locker with obvious reluctance and carefully maintained distance. "I wanted to apologize," Ashley said without preamble, echoing Blake's words from Friday, but with less apparent conviction. For the flyers and social media stuff, that was inappropriate. Kira studied the other girl's face, looking for signs of sincerity or calculation. Ashley's apology felt more strategic than genuine, driven by social pressure rather than actual remorse. "Thank you," she replied neutrally, unwilling to accept or reject the overture completely. "I know you probably don't trust me," Ashley continued, her words sounding rehearsed. "But I wanted you to know that I've learned from this experience about harassment and its effects on people." The careful phrasing suggested coaching, probably from parents or counselors who'd impressed upon Ashley the importance of appearing reformed. Her campaign to rehabilitate Blake's image had backfired so completely that she now needed rehabilitation herself. "I hope so," Kira said diplomatically. "If there's anything I can do to help with the self-defense program, I know it's probably weird hearing that from me, but I'd like to contribute somehow, maybe help with organization or promotion." The offer surprised Kira with its apparent sincerity, even if the underlying motivations remained questionable. Ashley's social connections and organizational skills could be valuable for program success, but accepting her help would require careful management of potential complications. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "There will probably be opportunities for people who want to help with logistics and promotion." Ashley nodded and walked away, leaving Kira to wonder whether former enemies could become genuine allies, or whether temporary cooperation simply masked continued antagonism. The week that followed brought steady progress on program development and continued evidence of shifted dynamics throughout the school. Students who'd never spoken to Kira before approached with questions about self-defense training or requests for advice about handling harassment situations. Her uncle arrived from New Mexico on Friday evening, bringing 8 years of accumulated wisdom about teaching practical skills to young people. Miguel Valdez was shorter than Kira had remembered, but his presence filled rooms with quiet authority and genuine warmth. "Look at you, Mija," he said, as he embraced her at the airport. "Standing tall and confident. This is the person I always knew you could become." The reunion felt profound after months of separation and the transformative events of recent weeks. Miguel represented connection to her authentic self, the skilled, confident person she'd hidden behind facades of careful invisibility. "Everything's different now," she told him during the drive home. "People look at me differently. They expect things from me that I'm not sure I can deliver." "What do you expect from yourself?" he asked with characteristic directness. The question required honest self-assessment that she'd been avoiding during weeks of rapid change and external pressures. "I want to help people who feel as powerless as I did," she said finally, "but I also want to finish school and have a normal life. Sometimes those goals feel contradictory." Miguel nodded with understanding, born from his own experiences with leadership responsibilities and community obligations. "The key is remembering that helping others starts with taking care of yourself. You can't protect people if you're overwhelmed or unprepared. So we build this program carefully, with proper support and realistic expectations." Saturday morning brought the first official planning meeting for the self-defense program, held in the school's main conference room with Principal Martinez, her parents, Uncle Miguel, and 3 school board members in attendance. The meeting exceeded everyone's expectations for productive collaboration and shared vision. Miguel's presentation about self-defense philosophy and practical training methods impressed the administrators with its emphasis on conflict avoidance and personal responsibility. "The goal isn't to create fighters," he explained, with the authority of someone who'd seen real combat and understood its costs. "It's to give young people confidence and practical skills they can use to stay safe." Most self-defense is about awareness and good decision-making, not physical techniques. School board member Patricia Hoffman asked pointed questions about liability and safety protocols that revealed careful preparation and genuine concern for student welfare. "What qualifications do you have for providing this kind of instruction?" she inquired with professional skepticism. Miguel produced copies of his military records, civilian instructor certifications, and letters of recommendation from community organizations in New Mexico that had benefited from his teaching. "I've been working with young people for 15 years, he said simply, teaching them to protect themselves and others. Not one student has ever been seriously injured during training, and several have used their skills to avoid dangerous situations." The credentials and track record satisfied administrative concerns while demonstrating the program's potential for positive impact. By the meeting's end, they'd secured official approval for a spring semester pilot program with dedicated funding and facility access. "This is remarkable," Principal Martinez said as the meeting concluded. "6 weeks ago, we had a harassment incident that could have ended very badly. Now we're implementing a program that could prevent similar situations from developing." Kira felt overwhelmed by the speed and scope of developments that had grown far beyond her original intentions. What had started as personal self-defense had become institutional change with potential to affect hundreds of students. The following weeks brought intensive preparation for the program launch. Miguel extended his visit to help develop curriculum and train assistant instructors from the school's physical education staff. The community center partnership expanded to include weekend sessions for family members and community volunteers. Blake Morrison surprised everyone by requesting admission to the first training cohort and demonstrating genuine commitment to learning conflict resolution alongside physical techniques. His participation provided political cover for the program while creating opportunities for genuine character development. "I've learned that being strong doesn't mean making other people feel weak," he said during one of the early sessions. "Real strength is protecting people who need help." Whether his transformation was permanent remained unclear, but his public commitment to anti-harassment principles influenced other students who'd previously followed his example in targeting vulnerable classmates. By December, the self-defense program had evolved into something larger than anyone had originally envisioned. Weekly training sessions attracted 40 regular participants, with additional students attending workshops on specific topics like situational awareness and conflict de-escalation. More importantly, harassment incidents throughout the school had declined dramatically as potential targets gained confidence and potential aggressors faced social pressure from peers who'd learned to recognize and interrupt bullying behaviors. "You've created something special here," Uncle Miguel told Kira as his extended visit came to an end. "Not just a training program, but a community of people who look out for each other." The assessment felt accurate as Kira reflected on how completely her circumstances had changed. The invisible girl who'd absorbed daily humiliation had become someone students approached for guidance and support. The transformation felt surreal, but also deeply satisfying. "I couldn't have done it alone," she replied honestly. "Everyone contributed something essential." That's the most important lesson of all, Mija. Real strength comes from bringing people together, not standing apart from them. Indeed, the spring semester brought continued growth and evolution for both the program and Kira's role within it. College application deadlines forced her to articulate how the year's experiences had shaped her goals and values, leading to acceptance letters from universities that appreciated her demonstration of leadership under pressure. Blake Morrison's transformation proved more durable than skeptics had predicted, culminating in his election as student body president on a platform emphasizing anti-harassment policies and inclusive school culture. His victory speech included direct acknowledgement of lessons learned through confronting his own behavior. "Last year, I was someone who made others feel small to make myself feel big," he said to an auditorium filled with classmates who remembered his previous behavior. "But I learned that real leadership means helping everyone feel valued and safe." Ashley Brennan found her own path to redemption through organizing awareness campaigns about the psychological impacts of harassment. Her social media skills, previously used for character assassination, became tools for education about bystander intervention and support resources. "I used to think popularity meant being feared," she reflected during one of the program's peer counseling sessions. "Now I understand that respect has to be earned through treating people well." Trevor Hutchins discovered genuine interest in conflict resolution and peer mediation, eventually becoming the program's most effective instructor for helping former bullies understand their impact on others. His analytical mind, once used to identify vulnerabilities to exploit, proved invaluable for developing intervention strategies. Even Derek Walsh found his place within the transformed social structure, using his networking abilities to connect isolated students with support resources and social opportunities. His transformation from nervous follower to proactive ally demonstrated possibilities for personal growth when toxic group dynamics were dismantled. As senior year drew to a close, Kira reflected on the profound changes that had resulted from her decision to defend herself in the cafeteria 18 months earlier. What had begun as a desperate response to immediate threats had evolved into systemic improvements that would benefit future students. The self-defense program had become a permanent part of the school's curriculum, with trained staff providing instruction and continuing education about personal safety and conflict resolution. Harassment incidents had decreased by nearly 70%, creating measurable improvements in school climate and student well-being. More significantly, the culture of silent complicity that had enabled systematic harassment had been replaced by active intervention networks where students felt empowered to speak up for each other. Bystanders had learned to recognize their responsibility for maintaining safe environments rather than simply avoiding personal targeting. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished," Principal Martinez said during their final meeting before graduation. "When you first walked into this office after that cafeteria incident, I never imagined it would lead to such positive changes for our entire school community." Kira nodded, still amazed by the transformation that had begun with a single moment of refusing to accept humiliation. The girl who had once measured success by how invisible she could remain was now being recognized for leadership that had created lasting institutional change. "I just wanted to be left alone," she said, echoing words she'd spoken countless times over the past 2 years. "I never planned to become someone other people looked to for guidance." "The best leaders rarely seek their positions," Martinez replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd observed many students grow into their potential. "They simply respond to circumstances with courage and principle, then discover that others want to follow their example." On graduation day, Kira walked across the stage to receive her diploma while her parents beamed with pride from the audience. Uncle Miguel had returned from New Mexico for the ceremony, his presence serving as a reminder of the confidence and skills that had made everything else possible. The valedictorian speech was delivered by Marcus Chen, who had evolved from quiet academic achiever to student government leader through his work with the anti-harassment initiatives. His remarks included direct reference to the changes that had transformed Westfield's culture. 2 years ago, many of us felt powerless against bullying and harassment that made school feel unsafe, he told the assembled graduates and families. But we learned that ordinary students can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept harmful behavior as normal. Blake Morrison, now student body president and bound for a prestigious university on an academic scholarship, sat in the front row with a humility that would have been unimaginable during his harassment campaigns. His transformation had become legendary among underclassmen who knew him only as an advocate for inclusive school policies. Ashley Brennan had been accepted to a communications program where she planned to study conflict resolution and peer mediation. Her senior project, a documentary about the psychological impacts of harassment, had won state-level recognition and would be used for educational purposes at schools throughout the region. Trevor Hutchins was heading to law school with interests in restorative justice and community organizing. His senior thesis on bystander intervention had been published in an academic journal and cited by researchers studying adolescent social dynamics. Even Derek Walsh had found his path, earning acceptance to a social work program where he hoped to help young people navigate difficult circumstances without compromising their values. His transformation from nervous follower to community advocate demonstrated the possibility for growth when toxic group dynamics were dismantled. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for photos and celebrations, Kira reflected on the profound changes that had resulted from her decision to defend herself rather than accept continued humiliation. What had begun as a desperate response to immediate threats had evolved into systemic improvements that would benefit countless future students. The self-defense program had been adopted by school districts throughout the state, with Uncle Miguel traveling regularly to train instructors and establish curricula. The approach they developed at Westfield, emphasizing confidence, awareness, and conflict avoidance alongside physical techniques, had become a model for addressing harassment through empowerment rather than punishment alone. More importantly, the culture of silent complicity that had enabled systematic harassment had been replaced by active intervention networks where students felt empowered to speak up for each other. The program's emphasis on bystander responsibility had created measurable improvements in school climate that extended far beyond the original participants. "Mija," Uncle Miguel said as they walked toward the parking lot after the ceremony, "do you remember what I told you about the difference between victims and survivors?" Kira smiled, recalling their conversation from years earlier when she'd first begun training in his garage. Victims let circumstances define them. Survivors use circumstances to define themselves. Exactly. But you've become something even more important than a survivor. You've become someone who helps others survive and thrive. The assessment felt accurate as she considered her plans for college and beyond. She'd been accepted to several universities with programs in education and social work, drawn to careers that would allow her to continue helping young people develop confidence and resilience. Her parents approached with expressions that mixed pride, amazement, and deep satisfaction at how their daughter's struggles had ultimately created opportunities to help others facing similar challenges. "We never imagined that moving to Colorado would lead to all this," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the crowd of students and families who'd been affected by the programs Kira had helped create. "Sometimes the hardest experiences teach us the most important lessons," Carlos added, with the philosophical perspective that came from watching his daughter transform pain into purpose. As they drove home through neighborhoods that had once felt hostile but now seemed welcoming, Kira thought about the letter she'd received the previous week from a middle school student in another district. The girl had attended one of the awareness workshops that had grown out of Westfield's program and wanted to thank her for showing that victims didn't have to remain powerless. "I used to think there was something wrong with me because kids picked on me," the letter had read. "But your story helped me understand that there's something wrong with people who hurt others, not with people who get hurt. And it showed me that I can learn to protect myself without becoming mean like them." The message captured everything Kira had hoped to accomplish through sharing her experiences and developing educational programs. Young people facing harassment needed to know that their circumstances could change, that they possessed more strength than they realized, and that seeking help was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. At home that evening, as she packed belongings for her move to college in the fall, Kira came across the journal she'd kept during her worst months at Westfield. Reading her old entries reminded her of the fear, hopelessness, and daily humiliation that had once defined her existence. The contrast with her current circumstances felt almost surreal. The girl who had written those desperate words had grown into someone featured in newspaper articles about innovative approaches to harassment prevention. The student who had eaten lunch alone in library corners was now receiving invitations to speak at conferences about peer leadership and community organizing. But the most meaningful changes were personal rather than public. She moved through the world with confidence earned through testing her capabilities under pressure. She formed relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate gratitude for any acceptance. She approached challenges with strategic thinking and community building rather than fearful isolation. Uncle Miguel had been right about the transformation that came from standing up for herself, but the reality had exceeded even his optimistic predictions. Defending herself against Blake's harassment had been about much more than stopping one incident. It had been about claiming her right to exist in the world with dignity and respect. The ripple effects continued expanding in ways she was only beginning to understand. Students throughout the region were learning that harassment didn't have to be accepted as inevitable, that bystanders could become allies, and that systemic problems could be addressed through coordinated community action. Her story had become part of a larger narrative about the possibilities for positive change when individuals refused to accept harmful circumstances as unchangeable. Schools were implementing programs based on principles she'd helped develop. Young people were finding courage to speak up for themselves and others. As she prepared for sleep on the night after graduation, Kira reflected on the journey that had brought her from frightened victim to confident leader. The path had been difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities she never could have imagined. The quiet girl, who had once hidden in empty classrooms to avoid harassment, was now planning a career devoted to helping others develop the confidence and skills they needed to create positive change in their own communities. She'd learned that standing up for yourself wasn't just about personal dignity, it was about modeling possibilities for everyone watching from the sidelines. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as she prepared for college and continued involvement in educational programs that had grown beyond anything she'd originally envisioned. But tonight, she fell asleep knowing that she'd kept faith with the values Uncle Miguel had taught her years earlier in that garage in Albuquerque. She'd learned to protect herself and others who couldn't protect themselves. She'd used violence only as a last resort, but when forced to defend herself, she'd done so decisively and effectively. Most importantly, she'd never let the cruelty she'd experienced turn her into someone who inflicted cruelty on others. The girl who had once bowed in a stairwell to avoid escalating conflict had grown into a woman who would never again accept humiliation as the price of peace. But she'd also become someone who understood that real strength came from lifting others up rather than putting them down. In the end, the most satisfying victory wasn't the moment she'd defeated Blake and his friends in the cafeteria. It was watching former enemies become allies, seeing isolated students find community, and knowing that her refusal to remain a victim had created possibilities for countless others to discover their own strength. The silent storm that had been building inside her for months had finally been unleashed, not in destructive fury, but in transformative power that had changed everything it touched. and that transformation would continue rippling outward for years to come, touching lives she would never meet, but whose circumstances had been improved by her courage to stand up and say, simply and definitively, no more.